April 22nd, 1945. Berlin, Germany. Deep beneath the ruined streets of the German capital, inside a concrete bunker buried under the Reich Chancellery Garden, the final chapter of the Third Reich is unfolding. The air inside the Führerbunker is heavy. Cigarette smoke hangs low beneath the ceiling. Maps of Europe cover the walls, but the colored lines that once marked German victories now mean almost nothing. Entire armies that used to exist on these maps are gone. Above ground, the sound never stops. Artillery. Soviet shells are crashing into Berlin every few seconds. Buildings are collapsing. Streets are burning. The Red Army is only a few kilometers away. The war that Adolf Hitler once promised would last 1,000 years is now measured in hours. Inside the bunker, senior officers gather around a large situation table. Many of them look exhausted. Some have not slept properly for days. Their uniforms are wrinkled. Their faces are pale. At the center of the room stands Adolf Hitler. He is no longer the man the world once feared. Witnesses later describe him as shaking slightly. His shoulders are bent. His left hand trembles uncontrollably. But the atmosphere in the room is not just tense. It is fragile. Everyone present understands something that few people outside the bunker know. Germany is losing the war. Not losing slowly. Losing completely. Only 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1941, German armies had stormed deep into the Soviet Union. Millions of soldiers marched east under the banner of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union would collapse within months. He told his generals that the Red Army was weak, that the Soviet system would crumble, that Germany was unstoppable. For a while, it looked like he might be right. German forces captured enormous territories. Kiev fell. Smolensk fell. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Then came winter. Then came Moscow. Then Stalingrad. And everything began to change. The war slowly turned against Germany. By 1943, the Red Army had regained the initiative. By 1944, German forces were retreating across Eastern Europe. Entire army groups were collapsing under massive Soviet offensives. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept the reality. Again and again, he told his generals that victory was still possible. New weapons would save Germany. New offensives would break the enemy. New armies would appear. But by April 1945, the illusion was gone. The Soviet Red Army had crossed the Oder River. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were closing in on Berlin. From the west, American and British forces were advancing through Germany. The Third Reich was surrounded. And now, on April 22nd, something happens inside the bunker that many historians consider the moment Adolf Hitler finally understood the truth. It begins with a military briefing. General Alfred Jodl and other officers report the latest situation at the front. One army that Hitler believed would attack the Soviets no longer exists. Another formation has failed to move. The divisions that were supposed to defend Berlin are either destroyed or retreating. Then comes the most important report, the Steiner counterattack. Hitler had ordered SS General Felix Steiner to launch an attack that would push the Red Army away from Berlin. In Hitler's mind, Steiner's forces would break the Soviet lines. They would relieve pressure on the capital. They would change the course of the battle. But the officers in the room now revealed the truth. Steiner never attacked. He couldn't. His units were too small, too weak, too scattered. The divisions that existed on paper simply did not exist on the battlefield. For a moment, the room falls silent. Hitler stands completely still. He looks down at the map in front of him. Then something happens that shocks everyone present. The man who had ruled Germany with absolute authority for 12 years suddenly loses control. Witnesses later describe an explosion of rage. Hitler begins shouting. He accuses the German army of betrayal. He says the generals have lied to him. He says the soldiers have failed him. According to those in the room, Hitler declares something that no one had ever heard from him before. The war is lost. But what he says next will reveal even more about his state of mind. Because Hitler does not blame himself. He blames Germany. And in that underground bunker, as Soviet artillery continues to pound Berlin above their heads, the final decisions of the Third Reich are beginning to take shape. Decisions that will lead directly to one of the most dramatic endings in modern history. April 22nd, 1945. Führerbunker, Berlin. The room is silent after Hitler's outburst. Officers stand frozen around the situation table. Many of them have served under Hitler for years. They have seen him angry before. They have heard his long speeches and his harsh criticism. But this moment feels different. This is not a speech. This is collapse. Hitler continues shouting at the generals in the room. His voice rises and falls as he points at the map spread across the table. Entire army groups that once existed across Eastern Europe are now nothing more than broken fragments. Cities that Germany captured in the early years of the war have all been lost. The Red Army is now fighting street by street in the outskirts of Berlin. Hitler accuses the German army high command of betrayal. He says the generals never supported him properly. He says the army failed to show the courage that the soldiers of the First World War once had. Some officers lower their heads and remain silent. Others stare at the floor. No one interrupts him. Then Hitler suddenly stops speaking. He looks again at the map of Berlin and the surrounding front lines. Soviet armies are closing from the north, east, and south. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces are approaching from the Oder River. Marshal Ivan Konev's armies are advancing from the south. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers are tightening the ring around the city. Hitler finally speaks again, but his voice is quieter now. According to witnesses present in the bunker, he says something that shocks the entire room. The war is lost. For years, Hitler had refused to say those words. Even when German forces were collapsing across Europe, he insisted that the situation would turn around. He believed in miracle weapons, last-minute counterattacks, and new divisions that could change the war. But now the truth is impossible to ignore. Germany has no armies left capable of stopping the Red Army. The officers in the room understand this clearly. Many of them already knew it before the meeting even began. Germany's last reserves had been thrown into desperate battles along the Oder and the Seelow Heights. Those units were now destroyed or retreating toward Berlin. Yet what Hitler says next surprises everyone even more. Instead of discussing surrender or evacuation, Hitler begins blaming the German people themselves. He says that if the German nation cannot win the war, then it deserves to be destroyed. According to several officers present, Hitler declares that the German people have proven themselves weak. In his view, if they are not strong enough to survive this war, then they have failed the test of history. This idea shocks even the most loyal men in the room. For them, Germany is still worth saving. Millions of civilians remain in Berlin. Women, children, and elderly people are hiding in basements as Soviet artillery pounds the city. But Hitler's thinking has changed. He no longer talks about saving Germany. He talks about its fate. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere becomes darker. Some officers slowly realize that Hitler is not planning to escape Berlin. Others suspect that he has already decided to stay in the city until the very end. Outside the bunker, the situation grows worse by the hour. On April 21st, Soviet artillery had already begun shelling Berlin. Now the bombardment is constant. Soviet tanks and infantry are moving through the eastern suburbs of the city. Entire districts are becoming battlefields. German soldiers, Volkssturm militia, and even teenage members of the Hitler Youth are being sent to defend streets and intersections. But inside the Führerbunker, Hitler still studies the maps. He begins giving new orders. Some of them sound unrealistic even to the officers who must carry them out. Hitler demands that scattered units regroup and launch counterattacks against the advancing Soviet armies. He believes that if these attacks succeed, the Red Army might still be pushed back from Berlin. But the generals know the truth. Those forces barely exist anymore. Many divisions listed on the situation map are only shadows of what they once were. Some have fewer than 1,000 soldiers remaining. Others have no fuel, no ammunition, and no tanks left. Despite this reality, Hitler continues issuing orders for attacks that will never happen. The meeting finally ends in silence. The officers slowly leave the room, each of them carrying the weight of what they have just heard. For the first time since the war began, Adolf Hitler has admitted that Germany cannot win. But instead of trying to save what remains, he has chosen a different path. And in the days ahead, that decision will shape the final hours of the Third Reich. Above them, Soviet artillery continues to fire. Berlin is burning, and time is running out. April 23rd, 1945. Berlin. The situation in the German capital is deteriorating rapidly. Soviet armies are pushing deeper into the city with every passing hour. Entire neighborhoods are already under Red Army control. The streets of Berlin are filled with smoke, debris, and the constant thunder of artillery. Inside the Führerbunker, the mood has changed after Hitler's admission that the war is lost. But instead of leading to surrender or negotiation, the situation becomes even more extreme. Hitler refuses to leave Berlin. Several officers suggest that he should escape south to Bavaria, where some German forces are still fighting and where the mountainous terrain might allow continued resistance. Others mention the so-called Alpine Fortress, a rumored defensive zone in southern Germany where Nazi leaders could regroup. Hitler rejects the idea immediately. He tells those around him that he will remain in Berlin until the end. In his mind, leaving the capital would be an act of weakness. If Germany collapses, he believes he must collapse with it. This decision sends shockwaves through the bunker. Some of Hitler's closest advisors had quietly hoped that he would agree to leave the city. If he escaped, the government might continue operating somewhere else. But now it becomes clear that Berlin is not just a battlefield. It will be the final stage of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, the Soviet advance is accelerating. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces have broken through the German defenses at the Seelow Heights east of Berlin. After days of brutal fighting, the last organized German resistance on the Oder front has collapsed. Now Soviet tank armies are pouring toward the city. From the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's forces are advancing quickly as well. His armies are racing north toward Berlin, determined to reach the city before Zhukov's troops take it alone. The competition between the two Soviet commanders adds even more pressure to the battle. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers are now surrounding Berlin from multiple directions. Inside the bunker, Hitler receives constant reports about the Soviet advance. Each update brings worse news. Bridges are falling into enemy hands, defensive lines are collapsing, German units are withdrawing or being destroyed. But Hitler still believes that a counterattack might save the city. He begins focusing on one man, General Walter Wenck. Wenck commands the German 12th Army, which is located west of Berlin. Hitler imagines that Wenck's army can turn east, attack the Soviets from behind, and break through to the capital. In Hitler's mind, this operation could relieve Berlin and stabilize the front. The order is issued. Wenck must attack immediately. But the reality on the ground is very different from what Hitler imagines inside the bunker. Wenck's army is already exhausted from fighting American forces in the west. Many of his units are under strength. Fuel and ammunition are scarce. The army is barely capable of defending itself, let alone launching a major offensive. Still, the order reaches Wenck. Attack toward Berlin, relieve the capital, break the Soviet encirclement. The generals inside the bunker know the chances are extremely small. But Hitler clings to the idea that one last operation could reverse the disaster. At the same time, Berlin itself is becoming a battlefield. German commanders inside the city are desperately organizing defenses. The regular army, the SS, police units, and the Volkssturm militia are thrown together in chaotic formations. Barricades are built in the streets. Anti-tank guns are placed at intersections. Young boys from the Hitler Youth are handed weapons in order to defend their neighborhoods. The Soviet advance continues street by street. Artillery shells crash into buildings. Soviet tanks push through shattered avenues. German defenders fight fiercely in some areas, but the Red Army has overwhelming numbers. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler continues studying the situation maps. But those maps are becoming meaningless. The lines change too quickly. Entire sectors disappear within hours. Communications with many German units are already broken. Some divisions no longer report at all. Despite all of this, Hitler continues to believe that Wenck's attack might still succeed. If Wenck reaches Berlin, the capital could be saved. If Wenck breaks the Soviet ring, the war might continue. But outside the bunker, reality is moving in a different direction. The Red Army is closing in, and Berlin is slowly being crushed. Obium, 500 plus Slov, April 24th, 1945. Berlin. The Soviet ring around the German capital is now almost complete. Armored units from Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front have pushed deep into the eastern districts of the city. From the south, Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front is advancing toward the outskirts of Berlin as well. Soviet artillery pounds the city constantly. Entire blocks collapse under the bombardment. Inside the Führerbunker, the situation grows more desperate with every report that arrives from the front. Hitler still waits for news about General Walter Wenck and the German 12th Army. According to the plan, Wenck's forces are supposed to attack eastward, smash into the Soviet flank, and open a corridor to Berlin. But the reports coming in tell a very different story. Instead of advancing toward the capital, Wenck's army is barely holding together. American forces are pressing from the west, Soviet units are approaching from the east, and thousands of German refugees are flooding the roads trying to escape the fighting. Wenck quickly realizes that his army is in no position to launch the offensive Hitler is demanding. Yet inside the bunker, Hitler continues to believe that Wenck will arrive. He studies the map again and again, moving units with his finger across the table. He speaks about divisions that barely exist. He talks about reserves that have already been destroyed. Several officers present during these meetings later say that Hitler seems increasingly disconnected from the reality outside the bunker walls. Still, the orders continue. Hitler commands Wenck to advance toward Berlin. He orders General Theodor Bussy and the German Ninth Army to hold their positions southeast of the city and link up with Wenck's forces. In Hitler's plan, Bussy's army will break through Soviet lines and move toward Berlin while Wenck attacks from the west. Together they will form a corridor and relieve the capital. On paper, the operation looks dramatic. In reality, it is impossible. The Ninth Army is already surrounded by massive Soviet forces in what will soon become known as the Halbe Pocket. Tens of thousands of German soldiers are trapped in forests and villages southeast of Berlin. Soviet tanks and artillery are closing in on them from all sides. Meanwhile, the battle inside Berlin itself grows more brutal. Soviet infantry units push deeper into the city. Tanks roll through shattered streets covered in rubble. German defenders fight from ruined buildings, subway tunnels, and makeshift barricades. Every intersection becomes a small battlefield. Civilians hide in basements while explosions shake the ground above them. Food is running out. Water systems are failing. Hospitals are overflowing with wounded soldiers and civilians. Inside the bunker, Hitler still refuses to accept surrender. When some officers quietly suggest that negotiations with the Western Allies might still be possible, Hitler rejects the idea completely. He insists that Germany must continue fighting until the very end. During one meeting, he states that if the German people have proven too weak to win the war, then they deserve the destruction that is coming. This statement deeply shocks several officers present. Even those who remain loyal to Hitler now begin to realize that he is no longer thinking about Germany's survival. He is thinking about the end. At the same time, new reports arrive from the battlefield. Soviet troops have reached several key districts of Berlin. The airport at Tempelhof is under attack. German defensive positions in the eastern suburbs are collapsing rapidly. Communications with many units inside the city are becoming unreliable. Some commanders are now fighting without clear orders, organizing resistance as best they can. Still, Hitler continues waiting for Wenck. He believes that if the 12th Army attacks soon enough, it might still reach Berlin. In his mind, the arrival of Wenck's forces will change everything. Soviet armies could be pushed back, the capital might be saved. But far outside the bunker, General Wenck is facing a completely different reality. His soldiers are exhausted and surrounded by chaos. Refugees fill the roads. American troops approach from one direction while Soviet forces advance from another. Wenck quickly understands that his army cannot reach Berlin in time, and the final battle for the city is already underway. April 25th, 1945. Berlin is now completely surrounded. Soviet forces from Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front advancing from the east and Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front pushing from the south have closed the final gaps around the city. The encirclement is complete. Berlin is cut off from the rest of Germany. Inside the Führerbunker, the news arrives quietly, but its meaning is clear to everyone present. There will be no reinforcements. No large armies are coming to break the Soviet ring. The German capital is trapped. Above ground, the battle grows even more violent. Soviet artillery units continue to bombard the city from every direction. The thunder of explosions shakes the bunker walls day and night. Buildings collapse across entire districts. Fires spread through ruined neighborhoods while smoke fills the sky over Berlin. Soviet troops are now advancing block by block toward the center of the city. German defenders fight desperately. Wehrmacht soldiers, SS units, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler youth groups try to slow the Soviet advance using barricades, anti-tank weapons, and small defensive positions inside ruined buildings. But the Soviet forces have overwhelming strength. They bring tanks, heavy artillery, and large infantry formations into every sector. Each hour, the Red Army moves closer to the government district. Inside the bunker, Hitler continues to follow the situation through maps and reports. But the information arriving is becoming incomplete. Communications with many German units inside Berlin have already broken down. Telephone lines are destroyed by artillery. Radio contact is unreliable. Officers often enter the conference room with partial information or outdated reports. Still, Hitler waits for the attack from General Wenck. He believes the German 12th Army will strike east and relieve the capital. Hitler repeats this expectation several times during military briefings. He orders officers to prepare for a link-up between Wenck's forces and the defenders of Berlin. But the officers listening know the truth. Wenck's army cannot reach the city. The German 9th Army, which Hitler expected to fight its way toward Berlin and support Wenck, is now trapped in the Halbe pocket southeast of the city. Soviet forces are crushing the surrounded German troops. Thousands of soldiers are trying to escape through forests and villages under heavy fire. The chances of these units reaching Berlin are almost zero. Yet Hitler refuses to abandon the plan. Instead, he becomes increasingly focused on defending the center of the city. He orders that key government buildings must be held at all costs. The Reich Chancellery, the Reichstag, and other important structures must not fall to Soviet troops. Berlin must resist. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders are pushing their armies forward with enormous pressure. Stalin wants Berlin captured as quickly as possible. The fall of the German capital will symbolize the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Soviet soldiers are fighting fiercely to reach the heart of the city. Entire tank brigades roll through shattered streets while infantry units clear buildings one by one. Snipers fire from upper floors. Machine guns echo through ruined apartment blocks. Every district becomes a brutal urban battlefield. Civilian suffering grows worse. Thousands of Berlin residents are hiding underground in subway stations, basements, and shelters. Food supplies are almost gone. Water lines are broken in many parts of the city. Hospitals struggle to treat endless numbers of wounded soldiers and civilians. Inside the bunker, Hitler receives another important report. General Helmuth Weidling, the commander responsible for defending Berlin, explains that Soviet forces are already approaching the inner districts of the city. German defensive positions are collapsing faster than expected. Ammunition supplies are critically low. Even the most determined defenders cannot stop the Soviet advance for long. The news darkens the atmosphere inside the bunker. Some officers begin quietly discussing the possibility of breaking out of Berlin. Others believe surrender might be the only way to save the remaining civilians in the city. But Hitler rejects any talk of surrender. He insists that Berlin will fight to the end. And as Soviet troops continue advancing toward the government district, the final battle for the capital of the Third Reich moves closer to its inevitable conclusion. April 26th to 27th, 1945. Central Berlin. The battle has now reached the heart of the German capital. Soviet forces are pushing through the inner districts of Berlin, closing in on the government quarter where the Reich Chancellery and the Führerbunker are located. The sound of artillery has grown even louder. The bunker shakes regularly from nearby explosions. Inside the underground complex, the atmosphere is tense but strangely routine. Military briefings continue several times a day. Officers bring in updated reports from what remains of the German defenses across the city, but each report tells the same story. German positions are collapsing sector by sector. Soviet infantry divisions are advancing through residential districts and government buildings. Tanks roll down shattered avenues while engineers clear barricades and mines. German soldiers still fight fiercely in many places, but they are outnumbered and outgunned. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defense, reports that the situation is becoming impossible to control. Soviet forces are now only a few kilometers away from the government district. Ammunition supplies are running dangerously low. Many units are fighting with limited communication and almost no reserves. Yet Hitler still refuses to consider surrender. Instead, he continues issuing orders that assume German forces can still organize counterattacks. He repeats the expectation that General Wenck's 12th Army will arrive from the west and relieve Berlin. He also insists that the trapped 9th Army southeast of the city must break through Soviet lines and link up with Wenck. The generals listening know that this plan has no real chance of success. The 9th Army is already fighting for survival in the forests around Halbe. Soviet forces are closing the pocket and destroying the remaining German units piece by piece. Only small groups of soldiers are managing to escape westward. A coordinated breakout toward Berlin is no longer possible. Meanwhile, Wenck's army is struggling simply to avoid being surrounded by American and Soviet forces. Wenck eventually makes a decision that shows how far reality has moved from Hitler's expectations. Instead of attacking toward Berlin, Wenck begins focusing on rescuing German soldiers and civilians trapped between the advancing Allied armies. His priority becomes helping refugees and surviving troops escape westward toward American lines. The message that Wenck cannot reach Berlin eventually reaches the bunker, but Hitler refuses to accept it. He insists that the attack must still happen. He repeats that Wenck must advance east. Officers leave the conference room carrying orders they know cannot be fulfilled. Above ground, the battle inside Berlin grows more brutal every hour. Soviet soldiers fight their way through apartment blocks and factory buildings. Tanks fire directly into defensive positions hidden inside ruined structures. German defenders launch small counterattacks from narrow streets and underground tunnels. The fighting is chaotic and extremely violent. Civilians continue to suffer in the middle of the battlefield. Many families remain trapped in basements while the fighting moves through their neighborhoods. Fires burn across large areas of the city as water supplies fail and emergency services collapse. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler's world becomes increasingly isolated. Most of the information he receives now comes through a small circle of officers and aides who move between the bunker and the outside command posts. Some reports are delayed or incomplete. Maps used during briefings no longer reflect the real situation on the ground. Yet Hitler continues to speak about victory in specific sectors of the city. He studies the map and gives detailed orders about troop movements that are already impossible. Several officers later recall that he seemed unwilling or unable to understand how close the Red Army already was. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders push their forces toward the central government district with growing urgency. Stalin wants the symbolic capture of Berlin and especially the Reichstag building. Soviet soldiers know that the end of the war in Europe is approaching and that Berlin represents the final objective. By April 27th, Soviet units are only a few kilometers from the bunker. The defenders of Berlin are running out of time, and inside the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler continues to plan battles that no longer exist. April 28, 1945, Berlin. The Soviet advance is now only a short distance from the center of the city. Entire districts of Berlin have fallen under Red Army control. Soviet tanks and infantry continue pushing westward through ruined streets, while German defenders retreat toward the government quarter. The battle for Berlin has become one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire war. Inside the Führerbunker, the situation is growing darker with every passing hour. Reports arriving from the city indicate that Soviet troops are now only a few blocks away from key government buildings. The Reichstag, the Reich Chancellery, and nearby structures are all within range of Soviet artillery and advancing infantry. German defensive positions are collapsing. General Helmuth Weidling, the commander responsible for the defense of Berlin, continues sending urgent reports to the bunker. His message is clear. The city cannot hold much longer. Ammunition supplies are nearly exhausted. Many defending units have been reduced to small groups of soldiers fighting independently. But Hitler still refuses to surrender. He continues holding military briefings even though the situation is beyond recovery. Officers gather around the map table as they have done for years throughout the war. But the maps no longer represent reality. Entire German formations that once filled those maps have disappeared. The Third Reich is now reduced to a few city blocks. On April 28th, another piece of shocking news reaches the bunker. The report concerns Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany and one of Hitler's closest allies for many years. As head of the SS, he had controlled enormous military and political power within the regime. For Hitler, Himmler had long been considered one of the most loyal figures in the Nazi leadership. But now, Hitler learns that Himmler has secretly attempted to negotiate with the Western Allies. Through intermediaries, Himmler had tried to open discussions with British and American representatives, hoping to arrange a separate surrender in the West, while continuing resistance against the Soviet Union. The news devastates Hitler. For him, it is the ultimate betrayal. Inside the bunker, witnesses later describe Hitler reacting with intense fury when he hears the report. He shouts that Himmler has betrayed him and betrayed Germany. For years, Hitler had demanded absolute loyalty from those around him. Now one of his most trusted leaders has attempted to negotiate behind his back. Hitler immediately orders Himmler stripped of all positions and declares him a traitor. The shock spreads through the bunker. If even Himmler is trying to escape the collapse of the regime, it becomes clear to many inside the bunker that the end is very near. At the same time, Soviet forces continue advancing toward the government district. Street fighting grows more intense as Red Army units approach the Reichstag and nearby buildings. Soviet artillery is now hitting targets extremely close to the bunker complex. The explosions shake the underground walls more frequently. Inside the bunker, Hitler begins making preparations for what he believes will be the final phase of his life. Several witnesses later say that his mood changes noticeably. The rage of previous days begins to give way to a more rigid and determined attitude. He has already decided that he will not leave Berlin. Now he begins discussing what will happen after his death. Hitler tells those close to him that he will not allow himself to be captured alive by the Soviet army. He fears that his enemies would display him publicly as a prisoner or execute him in a humiliating way. Instead, he plans to take his own life. This decision spreads quietly among the people inside the bunker. Some officers and staff members are shocked when they hear it. Others had already suspected that Hitler would never surrender. Outside the bunker, Soviet soldiers continue moving closer to the center of Berlin. Inside the bunker, Adolf Hitler is beginning to prepare for the final act of the Third Reich. April 29, 1945. Führerbunker, Berlin. By now, the Soviet army is fighting only a few hundred meters from the Reich Chancellery. The center of Berlin has become a battlefield of rubble, fire, and collapsing buildings. Soviet artillery pounds the government district relentlessly. Tanks move through shattered streets while infantry units fight from house to house. Inside the Führerbunker, the situation has reached its final stage. Adolf Hitler has accepted that the war is over, but his reaction is not surrender. Instead, he begins preparing the final political and personal acts of his life. Late on the night of April 28th and into the early hours of April 29th, Hitler summons several of his closest staff members to the bunker conference room. Among them are Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and a few trusted aides. Hitler announces that he will dictate his last will and political testament. The document is recorded by his secretary while Hitler slowly dictates his final words. In this testament, Hitler once again blames others for the disaster of the war. He accuses the generals, foreign enemies, and political conspirators of causing Germany's defeat. Even at this final moment, he does not accept responsibility for the destruction of Europe or the collapse of the Third Reich. He continues to claim that Germany fought bravely and that the war was forced upon the nation by its enemies. The testament also contains Hitler's final political instructions. He declares that after his death, Admiral Karl Dönitz will become the new head of the German state. Joseph Goebbels will serve as chancellor. Other positions in the collapsing government are assigned as well. But these decisions mean little. The German state they are supposed to lead no longer truly exists. While the document is being prepared, another event takes place inside the bunker that surprises many of those present. Hitler decides to marry Eva Braun. Eva Braun had been Hitler's companion for many years, but their relationship had always remained mostly hidden from the public. Now, in the final hours of the war, Hitler chooses to formalize that relationship. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, a small civil ceremony takes place inside the bunker. The wedding is brief. A government official reads the necessary legal statements while a few witnesses stand nearby. Hitler and Eva Braun sign the marriage documents. For a short moment, the bunker witnesses something almost surreal. A wedding ceremony taking place while the capital of Germany is being destroyed above them. After the ceremony, a small gathering follows. Hitler briefly congratulates the participants and thanks them for their loyalty. Those present later recall that his behavior appears calm and controlled. The violent rage of previous days seems to have faded. Instead, Hitler now speaks in a quiet and determined tone. But the reality outside the bunker continues to grow worse. Soviet forces are advancing closer to the Reichstag and the government quarter. German defensive positions are collapsing rapidly. General Weidling reports that the defenders can no longer hold the Soviet advance for much longer. Some German units are already fighting only a few streets away from the bunker complex. Inside the bunker, Hitler receives these reports without surprise. He has already made his final decision. He tells those close to him that he will remain in Berlin and die there. He repeats that he will never allow himself to be captured by Soviet forces. He also orders that after his death, his body must be burned so that the enemy cannot display it publicly. The instructions are clear. Gasoline is prepared for that purpose. Meanwhile, the Soviet army continues its advance through central Berlin. Red Army soldiers are now fighting around the Reichstag and nearby buildings. Soviet commanders know that the capture of these structures will symbolize the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Inside the bunker, Hitler spends the rest of the night completing his testament and preparing for what he believes will happen the following day. The Third Reich is now living its final hours. April 30th, 1945. Berlin. The final morning of the Third Reich begins under constant artillery fire. Soviet guns continue bombarding the center of Berlin, while Red Army soldiers push toward the Reichstag and the government district. The battle for the capital is reaching its final stage. Inside the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler wakes, knowing that this will be his last day. The underground complex is quieter than usual. Most of the people inside already understand what is about to happen. Rumors have spread through the bunker that Hitler plans to end his life rather than allow himself to be captured by Soviet forces. The military situation leaves no doubt about the outcome. Soviet troops are only a short distance away. Many defensive positions around the Reich Chancellery have already collapsed. German units inside Berlin are exhausted and running out of ammunition. General Helmuth Weidling sends another report to the bunker during the morning briefing. The message is direct. The defenders of Berlin can hold out only for a short time. The Soviet advance cannot be stopped. Without reinforcements, the remaining German forces will soon be overwhelmed. For the first time during the battle for Berlin, Hitler allows a commander to consider surrender. But the permission comes too late. By now, Soviet forces are already fighting extremely close to the government district. Even if a surrender order is issued, many German units may not receive it in time. Inside the bunker, Hitler gathers several of his closest staff members and officers. He speaks calmly and thanks them for their loyalty. Many of the people present have served him for years. Some are emotional during the meeting, others remain silent. Hitler explains that he will stay in Berlin and die there. He repeats the instructions he gave the previous night. After his death, his body must be burned so that it cannot fall into enemy hands. He tells his aides that he does not want to be captured and displayed by the Soviet Union. Those present listen quietly. Some later recall that Hitler appears physically exhausted but mentally determined. His hands tremble slightly and he moves slowly, but his voice is steady. Around midday, Hitler eats his final meal in the bunker dining room. It is a simple vegetarian meal, as he had often preferred during the war. Several secretaries and staff members are present during the meal, but the conversation is brief. Afterward, Hitler says goodbye to many of the people who have worked in the bunker. Some shake his hand, others salute. A few people are visibly crying. Then Hitler returns to his private room together with Eva Braun, now his wife. Only a small group of close aides remain nearby in the corridor. They know what is about to happen, but no one enters the room. Shortly after 3:30 in the afternoon, a gunshot is heard from inside. The door is opened. Inside the room, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun are found dead. Eva Braun has taken poison. Hitler has shot himself while also using poison capsules prepared earlier. The instructions that Hitler gave earlier are immediately carried out. His body and Eva Braun's body are wrapped in blankets and carried through the bunker corridors to the garden of the Reich Chancellery above ground. Soviet artillery shells continue exploding nearby while several aides place the bodies into a shallow crater. Gasoline is poured over them. The bodies are set on fire. Those present stand nearby while the flames burn. The leader who had ruled Nazi Germany for 12 years is now gone. Inside the bunker, the remaining staff members understand that the Third Reich has effectively ended, but above them, the battle for Berlin continues. Soviet forces are still fighting their way through the final German defenses in the government district. Within hours, the Reichstag will fall, and the war in Europe will finally come to its end. May 1st to 2nd, 1945. Berlin. By the evening of April 30th, the man who had once ruled most of Europe was dead. Adolf Hitler's suicide inside the Führerbunker marked the true collapse of the Nazi regime, even though the battle for Berlin was still raging above ground. Inside the bunker, the remaining members of Hitler's inner circle now faced a decision. The man whose authority had held the system together was gone. Without him, the Third Reich was little more than a collection of isolated military units fighting in ruins across Germany. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, and newly appointed chancellor according to Hitler's political testament, briefly assumed leadership inside the bunker. Goebbels had been one of Hitler's most loyal followers throughout the entire war. He believed deeply in the Nazi cause and had remained in Berlin even when many other leaders fled the collapsing regime. But even Goebbels knew the situation was hopeless. The Red Army was now fighting only meters away from the bunker complex. Soviet troops had already captured many of the surrounding buildings in the government district. The Reichstag, one of the most symbolic buildings in Germany, had become the center of intense fighting between Soviet and German forces. On the night of April 30th and the early hours of May 1st, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag after brutal combat inside the building. The image of the Soviet flag flying above the Reichstag quickly became one of the most famous symbols of the end of the war in Europe. For the soldiers of the Red Army, this moment represented the defeat of Nazi Germany after 4 years of devastating war on the Eastern Front. Inside the bunker, the remaining German leaders listened to reports of the Soviet advance with growing despair. They understood that Soviet troops would soon reach the bunker itself. Some officers began discussing plans to escape the city by breaking through Soviet lines during the night. General Weidling, who commanded the defense of Berlin, informed the bunker leadership that the remaining defenders could not continue fighting for much longer. Ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted, communications had collapsed, and organized resistance was breaking apart across the city. Goebbels briefly considered surrendering, but he ultimately refused. Like Hitler, he believed that life after the collapse of the regime was meaningless. On May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda made a decision that shocked even some of the hardened officers still inside the bunker. They poisoned their 6 children. Shortly afterward, Goebbels and his wife also took their own lives in the garden above the bunker, following the same path that Hitler had chosen the previous day. By this point, the bunker had effectively ceased functioning as a government headquarters. Remaining staff members and soldiers began preparing for breakout attempts from the city. Small groups hoped to escape westward and surrender to American or British forces instead of falling into Soviet captivity. Some managed to slip through the chaotic battle lines during the night. Many others were captured or killed. Meanwhile, Soviet forces continued their final assault on the remaining German defenses in central Berlin. Tanks and infantry units cleared the last pockets of resistance around the government district, subway tunnels, and nearby buildings. On May 2, 1945, General Feidling officially surrendered Berlin to Soviet forces. The battle for the German capital was over. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Berlin represented the ultimate victory after years of brutal war that had devastated enormous parts of the country and caused millions of deaths. For Germany, it marked the complete collapse of the Nazi regime that had ruled the country since 1933. Just days later, on May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany formally surrendered to the Allied powers, bringing the war in Europe to an end. The bunker where Hitler had spent his final days would soon be abandoned and later destroyed. But the events that took place inside those underground rooms in April 1945 remain one of the most dramatic endings in modern history. The moment when the man who once believed he could dominate the world finally admitted that the war was lost.